Hi there. My name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm being joined by Kaitlyn McGrath. Kaitlyn is the Toronto Blue Jays beat writer for The Athletic. In this episode, I chat with Kaitlyn about how she got into journalism, her experience covering news, joining The Athletic, and her approach to feature articles on the Toronto Blue Jays. If you've been following along this Weesports Quarantine Chronicles journey, make sure to like, watch, and subscribe to my YouTube channel on the bottom right hand of your screen. This is episode 13 of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I am joined by Kaitlyn McGrath. She is the Toronto Blue Jays beat writer at The Athletic. Kaitlyn, welcome to the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? I mean, I'm good, all things considered, you know. I feel like it's sort of becoming normal life now. It feels like just like yesterday that you and I actually were in Florida together.
Easy.
And I really did not anticipate that this is where I would be sitting on May 14th. But here we are, and I'm making the best of it. And I'm super happy to chat with you today.
Yeah, and like you said, we were both in Dunedin, and it felt like one of the last normal spring training games. We had the pregame scrum with Charlie Montour. We were all close together, not abiding by social distancing. The fans were coming into TD Ballpark, and then that week, the whole sports world shut down. So maybe we could just start right there and just say and ask you, Kaitlyn, like, what was that like for you as a Blue Jays beat reporter, having to try to, cover this team while the whole world is dealing with this pandemic coming before our very eyes?
Yeah, so I did 2 stints in Florida. Well, I was meant to do 2 full stints in Florida. So I had gone down to Dunedin in February when spring training kicked off. And then everything had been normal, right? I did 2 weeks there. And I guess the pandemic was in the news then, but it hadn't really quite come to North America yet. So honestly, I'll admit that I really wasn't thinking too far down the road that it would impact. I was sort of just watching the news and keeping informed about it, but I really didn't understand the gravity of the situation that could be coming down the road. And so then I came back home, and then I went back down to Florida in March. And that is definitely where things were getting a little bit more serious. But I would say again, I mean, I traveled to Florida, and I really didn't expect that in a week's time or whatever it ended up being, I would be back in Toronto and spring training would be shut down. I think a lot of us really didn't expect it to unfold that quickly. I mean, I think the sports world in general didn't really think that it would unfold that quickly. So I remember being down in Florida, and it was starting to become a little bit more serious because they had chosen to close the clubhouse to the media. They didn't want us in the players sort of area just to like keep up social distancing, and things were getting a little bit more serious. And that's when I kind of had an idea, okay, like this is probably not going to be a normal spring training from here on out. And then I think maybe it was like a day or so after that things got very serious when the NBA decided to shut down their season because they had a player test positive. And that was sort of when I realized, okay, there's not going to be any more spring training. I don't see the season happening on time. And at that point, you're kind of in a frame of mind where you're still down there reporting, as you say. So I'm reporting on the team, and I'm reporting on the players, and I'm also reporting on how they're adapting to the pandemic and what's going to happen. But then you're also a little bit thinking about yourself because you're in Florida. I'm not close to home. I have to find a way to figure out how to get home fairly quickly. So luckily, the work environment that we have is that all the beat writers work very closely together, and we all support each other. So the next day, I think we went to camp, and I think that was probably the last full day of games. And we all were kind of like, okay, like let's figure out what flights we can get on. Like, let's figure out our travel plans because we don't think we're going to be here much longer. And even if they don't stop, I think it was like the announcement, we were sort of sitting around waiting for it. And I think it came like late afternoon. And I think at that point, most of us had sort of like circled a flight. We're like, okay, I think we're going to come home no matter what tomorrow. And then of course, when it was confirmed that spring training was going to be stopped, all of us booked our flights and we came back the next day. And, you know, then you're basically based in your apartment. And that's what I was doing. I did 14 days of self-isolation just because I'd been traveling. And then after that period of time was up, then I've just been sort of living the way everybody else has, which is basically like, you know, one trip to the grocery store per week, a little bit of exercise when I can squeeze it in, you know, walks, you know, being safe all throughout, but that's about it. And just writing, trying to come up with some content, trying to be a little bit creative, trying to stay up to date with the news. And yeah, that's sort of in my life right now.
Yeah, and you mentioned, you know, creating content during a time of no sports. It's a challenge, but it also presents unique opportunities. I know that you wrote a great piece about Blue Jays in pop culture. You've also done some, you know, feature stories, which we'll get into later on. But how, for you, have you been able to work with your team at The Athletic to just, you know, produce this really, you know, engaging content when there is no sports going on? Because at first it feels like a challenge, but like I said, like there are opportunities where you can find really creative ways to still, you know, entertain the subscribers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, as you say, it is a bit of a chance to be a little bit more creative. And for the pop culture story, for example, I mean, I wouldn't really have the time to do that in seasons. I certainly could have done that story in the off season, but I just hadn't thought of the idea yet, I guess. And so then this just afforded me some time to sort of dig in and just, you know, watch movies and find little screenshots of Blue Jays gear and stuff. So I definitely had the time to do that. But yeah, we've just been trying to be as creative as possible. And I have a really great team at the Athletic Toronto, and I'm always inspired by like some of my other writers as well, like Blake and Eric on the Raptors beat, and our Leafs reporters are really good. I mean, everybody at the Athletic has been really creative, and I will admit that like I just like kind of browse the site every day and see what other kind of writers have come up with. Something that I did a couple weeks ago was like a letter from the future, where I kind of imagined the Blue Jays' future in 2025. I think I said they were defending World Series champions in 2025. And that idea came from one of my colleagues in Detroit, Cody. He did a story that was similar because the Tigers are kind of in a similar position as the Blue Jays. They're rebuilding and they're looking ahead, and, you know, they're probably going to be back in contention maybe a few years after the Blue Jays hope to be, but it's still around that same timeline. So he had done something similar, and I automatically was like, oh, this would work perfectly for the Blue Jays. So we've been pretty good about sharing ideas, and I can reach out to my colleagues. Like, I think maybe I reached out to him and was like, just kind of like, how did you do it, or how did you imagine it, or kind of thing. Like, we did something the other day too, which was like sort of we called it an envy draft, where like you drafted traits and qualities of the other American League East teams amongst us. So that was also an idea that they had done between the leagues, like the NHL, the NFL. And so we kind of were like, oh, this would work for the AL East, so let's just do that. And of course, like the Yankees and the Red Sox have so many desirable qualities of their organization, and the Orioles less so. So it was really fun to be creative and find ways to like take from all those teams. So I think a benefit has just been everybody's been working together really well. So that's been actually fun to have a bit more chance to work together with some other people that you don't normally get to work with, because everybody has a little bit more time and there's not so much traveling to the ballparks and traveling and, you know, grinding through 162 games and stuff. So that's been fun to do. It's trying to make the best of the situation. I think all of us would rather be reporting on games, but, you know, we want to make sure that that happens when it's safe to do so, and safe for us and the players and just the general public, everybody, coaches. Like, I think there's so much that needs to happen before baseball comes back, but I think we're still remaining hopeful that it could.
Yes, I definitely am remaining hopeful, and I'm also hopeful that your letter to the future comes true, because I think a lot of Blue Jays fans would love to hear back-to-back World Series champions. Yeah. And it's funny that with that pop culture article that you wrote, I don't know if you've been following The Last Dance, but I believe in episode 7, the Blue Jays were featured against the Chicago White Sox in the 1993 ALCS, because in one of those games, it was the night before Michael Jordan retired from basketball for the first time to then pursue a baseball career. So might be a nice little nugget to add for your next pop culture piece. But hey, Kayla, I want to get into your, journey into sports journalism, and for you, you went to Western, to pursue journalism. But I'm just curious why you wanted to get into this industry.
Yeah, when I was at university in my undergrad at Western, I had an idea that I wanted to go into journalism. I kind of grew up really loving sports, and actually initially I kind of wanted to be more of like a TV sports anchor, like a TSN Sports Center kind of anchor. But anyway, I went to Western, and they had a student paper there that was very easy to start volunteering for. You basically just had to walk into the office and you were able to write. So I basically just walked in one day, and pretty early on in my first year at Western, and just asked if I could start writing. And eventually I made my way to the sports section, just started writing sports then and there. And that's when I realized I kind of really liked writing about sports. And so I just sort of started doing it because I really enjoyed it. And it sounds, I don't know if it sounds like conceited to say, but it just came kind of really naturally to me. Like I just found myself really enjoying it, and I found the flow of writing articles just suited me. I was an English major, so I was used to writing a lot. So it just maybe was a nice escape from writing academically as well. So anyway, so I worked at the campus paper for my entire undergrad. And then from there, I knew I wanted to pursue journalism more seriously. So I did my master's in journalism also at Western. And then through my master's program, I was able to secure some internships that led me basically back to Toronto, which is where I grew up. So I did an internship at the Globe and Mail to complete my my degree. We had to do like a mandatory internship. So I did that at the Globe and Mail. And then I came back to Toronto that summer and I did an internship at the CBC. And then from there, I had a nice resume put together. So then I was able to actually get my first job at the National Post. And that was actually how I got my foot into the door in sports, because the Globe and the CBC gig had both been news. CBC, it kind of involved news, but it was a little bit current affairs too. So I was able to do a few kind of sports stories that kind of at CBC, but it technically was more so news. So then I just kind of lucked into the opportunity at the Post. I had applied for an internship and didn't get it because I had taken another internship. And so then they called me back in the end of the summer and we're like, oh, we still have your application from the internship and we have this other job. It's an entry-level job. It was the entry level of like web editor, basically sports web desk editor. And so they said, do you want to apply for this? And I said, yeah, sure. And so they asked me in for an interview anyway. And my first editor was actually, he also went to Western and he also worked at the campus paper that I had worked at. So he recognized that on my application. And so that I think really helped me as well, because I don't know, sometimes being a fellow alumni can really help you out. And so he was familiar with how I would have been sort of trained at the student paper. So that's how I basically got my foot in the door at the National Post. And when I started there, people like Eric Kareen and Sean Fitzgerald and John Lott, they all worked there. So they became my colleagues and they've basically been my colleagues ever since. And so I've just been sort of pursuing journalism from there. My first job was a web desk job, and I worked a desk job for, my first at least, I want to say like 4.5 years maybe in journalism. And then I didn't get a full-time sort of reporting job until last baseball season. At the start of the Blue Jays season, I was basically given the Blue Jays beat job. And so I've been doing that for the last 2 years. So my background is a little bit mixed. There's some news internships, there's some desk jobs, copy editing jobs, web editing jobs, all kinds of stuff. I've done every sort of job you can do, newspaper, web, all kinds of stuff. So that kind of led me here. And I think it's all helped me in various different ways.
I want to focus on the news side when you were with the Globe and Mail and CBC. And when doing some research for this interview, I noticed that you wrote on the ice storm back in 2013 and pales in comparison to what we're dealing with now. But I tell you, back in 2013, that was the crisis in Ontario. But when you wrote those news stories and learned how to cover news, how did it prepare you for then being able to cover sports? Because I find for a lot of young sports journalists, they're like, they want to get into sports, they want to get that right away, but sometimes you got to do the news stories before you then are able to cover sports.
You know, it's a totally good point, and this point I make a lot, not just about news, but I just say like there's a lot of young eager journalists, which is great, a lot of young eager sports journalists, and they just want to say, I want to do what you do. And it's like, well, I had to do a lot of jobs before I got to do what I had to do. And the thing is, I always tell young journalists, whatever job you're doing, do that job so well, even if it's not the job you want to do for your whole life. You know, I always wanted to be a writer, particularly a sports writer, but when I was a web editor, I was trying to be the best web editor I can be, because you know what, when you're a great web editor and you're a great copy editor, your writers love you. And when your writers love you, like people that I now work with now, when they love you, they will help you out. So, you know, when you're an ally to them, when you're helping writers out because, you know, they want to fix a sentence or they want to, you know, make a little change, or you're available, they'll love you for that. And I really think that my connections that I made with some of those reporters, I mean, they're still some of my best friends today. They're still my colleagues today, and they've always been there for me. And I think a lot of that was just sort of trying to be the best sort of partner to them that I could be in the ways that we work together. But back to your point about news, yeah, so I remember like when I did my Globe and Mail internship, at that point in my sort of journalistic development, I actually did want to be a news reporter. I just thought there would be more opportunity for me at the time, just getting my foot in the door somewhere. There's so many more news internships than there were sports at the time. So even though I think I like kind of still applied to a few sports internships, I like obviously the National Post one, I still had more applications out for news. And so I was definitely interested in that. And I did the Globe and Mail internship. As you say, it was in the winter, it was the ice storm. And I remember like I was living with my parents and we did not have power for days. Like we were probably without power like I can't remember now, but it's probably 3, maybe 4 days. And so I remember just being an intern and being so tired, writing about this story, not being able to like sleep because it was freezing in my house. I couldn't like shower. I couldn't like, it was just freezing. And I just remember being like so tired and just like that so like worn down intern. I look back on that experience and I absolutely loved it, but I just remember in the moment I was like, I can't do this. Like, am I going to survive this? Like, can I be a journalist? Can I handle it? Like, it was just so stressful in the moment. But then looking back, I'm like, I handled it. It was fine. You know, it was a good learning experience. I grew from it. But yeah, I think like it was a little bit of time between my internship at the Globe and Mail to when I became a writer. So it's hard for me to say like, did it directly help me because I had done so many jobs in between, but I do think that it probably just prepares you a little bit that when something happens in the sports world that is a bit more newsy, you can at least say like, okay, I've handled this before. I know how to write this. And sometimes it happens. Like I was on the Blue Jays beat when Roberto Osuna was arrested and we had to start covering a court case. And that's something that you learn from covering news. And I had covered courts before from being in news and doing it in journalism school. So as much as sports primarily is about writing a game story and doing profiles on athletes and all that kind of stuff, a lot of times like newsy items come into play in sports too. And so I think like maybe indirectly it helped me just with the sort of confidence that I have this in my back pocket. I know I can do it. I've done it before. And so when the sort of opportunity of a news item presents itself in sports, at least you're like, okay, I can handle this. I can do this, you know?
No, I completely agree. And I just think you become more aware of the world around you by doing news. And I think that while sports, you know, is considered the toy land of society and often, you know, great things, there is a wider society world out there. And I just think having that understanding of how the world works, you know, just makes you more versatile as a journalist. You mentioned, Kaitlyn, about, working with, your colleagues, Eric Kareen, Sean Fitzgerald, John Lott at the National Post. Of course, they're now at The Athletic with you. When you joined The Athletic, now it obviously has taken off and it's had great success. But when you first joined, was it considered a risk to go to that platform that, at that time was just a startup company getting started in covering and reporting sports?
So at the time, it wasn't a huge risk for me because I had been laid off from the National Post along with Eric and John. Sean had actually left the Post by then, but then he got laid off at the Star anyway. So I didn't have a full-time job at the time, and I had been working sort of contract jobs to that point. So when The Athletic approached me, they had already previously approached Eric and John. And so I knew about it through them. And they were the ones that actually connected me with the people that I needed to be connected with in order to pursue that opportunity. And they had obviously given me a sort of a recommendation. So that's how I got in at The Athletic. But at the time, for me personally, it wasn't a huge risk because I really didn't have anything to lose. I wasn't leaving a full-time job. I didn't have a full-time job. And I was not quite a year out. I was almost a year out from my layoff, I think. So it had almost been a year since I'd worked at the paper. And so, I'd been filling in with little gigs. And so I was leaving those, but again, they weren't full-time. So it felt like an actual really perfect opportunity for me to take, just because I was like, well, if it doesn't work out, at least I gave it a shot. Yeah. And if it does work out, that's great, right? So I think a lot of us, I don't want to speak for them, like my other colleagues, but for me at least, it didn't feel like a huge risk. It felt very exciting at the time. But it was risky in the sense that we didn't know how it would turn out. At the time, it was just Chicago had started, and then Toronto, I believe, was the second city. And it was very much a startup back then. I mean, there was like a handful of employees, still sort of figuring out what our kind of voice was going to be, how we were going to cover the teams, which teams we were going to cover, all that kind of stuff. So it was very it's exciting to think back on what it's become now, because I was definitely on the ground floor of it in Toronto. And, now I would love to say I totally predicted it would be like this, but I don't know that I knew how big it would get and how quickly it would expand. And obviously I'm happy that it's gone the way that it's gone. And, I do feel a little bit of, satisfaction, I suppose, just knowing that, it was circumstance and I was just lucky in the sense that I could be on the ground floor of it, but it is nice to know that you really saw the company start from sort of the first floor and it's built up to what it is now.
No, for sure. The decision has clearly paid off, and it's great. And you mentioned earlier that you're now the Toronto Blue Jays beat writer. And I'm just curious for you, when you first, got that opportunity and you're, a new beat writer on the scene covering the Blue Jays, was that an intimidating experience for you, being surrounded by journalists covering the team that have been there for many years? Or have the experiences that you had done at other places, writing, covering sports, did that help prepare you for this moment and make you feel more comfortable when you got the chance to cover the Jays?
I think I was comfortable socially because I had known just from being in the sports industry, the Toronto sports journalism scene isn't huge. So even though I had not been a full-time reporter, I've done, little part-time gigs, and I'd filled in for other reporters when I'd been at the paper and some other online stuff. So I knew enough of the people that I was at least comfortable, getting socially, I could get along with everybody and the beat and everything. So that for me was fine. I wasn't super intimidated by joining the beat, but definitely becoming a beat writer, just really sort of jumping into it that season. I did not go to spring training that season just because there was sort of things that I had to, because I was in a previous job before then. I was still the web editor at the Athletic. So sort of tying up loose ends on that end. So I didn't actually start until really the first game of the season or whatever it was. So that for me was, I guess I felt a little bit intimidated from that just because I didn't know the players and I was just kind of jumping in at the start of the season. And I'm still learning. I think I keep learning every day. Even this experience is a huge learning experience, but it's all about like repetitions. And for me, it's all about sort of just, it's about repetitions, and it's just about starting to feel comfortable with your own voice. I think that took me probably the first full season, and it's still something that I'm doing now. It's just like kind of figuring out, I'm not going to be this type of writer. I can't write like this person who works at this outlet, and this person's covered the team for 20 years and he's a columnist, and this person's covered the team since they won the World Series and she's a columnist. And so it was figuring out, okay, well, what can I bring to my own coverage that makes it unique, and what can be different, because I don't want to just try to be like somebody else, because I can't outright somebody who's been doing it for 20 years and has their voice developed. So I really wanted to like figure out my own voice, how I wanted to cover the team, what ideas I wanted to pursue and how I wanted to do them. So that for me took a while, definitely the first full season, and even the second season. And this season I was still I was learning, but I was getting more comfortable and feeling like this is the groove that I need to be in. Like, this is how I will feel satisfied. These are the stories I need to tell. And so, I will admit I was really looking forward to covering the 2020 Blue Jays, because that my timing of covering this team has really coincided with the sort of final teardown and start of the buildup. So I was looking forward to kind of continuing that narrative arc this season. Still going to have an opportunity to do that. It's just going to be coming at a little bit later of a time. But yeah, I think, my general advice would sort of just be like, if you are in a situation like me and you're starting a new beat, just really, don't get so wrapped up into what everyone else is writing. It's important to be informed. It's important to know like what your colleagues are writing and sort of what angles they're taking. But definitely just focus on yourself, and what you can do as a writer. How best you can write a story, what stories you should pursue. And it's like the standard, like sort of life advice is like, don't try to be somebody you're not. Like, try to be yourself, because I think when you're doing that, that's when your best work comes out.
No, that's very true. And specifically the points you made about finding your voice and just repetition and getting those reps in. And you've had the chance to, get involved and do some features on many baseball players, most notably Bo Bichette recently. And speaking of that narrative arc about the team starting to build up with young players, you've had the chance to write about Bo a couple of times. And I'm curious, when you're making a proposal for a feature to an editor, to your editor, do you like map out what the article is, what you're going to ask, like right away? Or do you sort of give a general idea and then let the interviews, the research dictate what the story is going to look like when it's finally published?
It depends. Like it depends how you even come to the idea. Like, for example, when the Blue Jays signed Ryu, after you do the news story, you do his signing story and stuff, and then after that it's like, okay, how do we tell a secondary story? And so my editor and I like wanted to do a story where it was like, who is this pitcher? Like, how did he become the pitcher that he is today? And who did the Blue Jays just give $80 million to? What kind of pitcher is he? What is he going to bring to the team? How did he develop? He has an interesting story because he started his career in Korea. He maybe is seen as somewhat of a late bloomer because he had just had his best season like last year. He had injuries, so he had a lot of stuff. And the thing is, he played in the NL with the Dodgers, and that's not a team that is entirely familiar to, especially the AL East and Toronto fans, because you don't often see them, right? So there was a lot to learn about him. So in that example of a story, we kind of knew like this is going to be a story where we're establishing like who is the pitcher the Blue Jays just signed? Like, why did they sign him? why should fans be excited about him? What is he going to bring to the team? And so then when you go and do the interviews, for that, it was like talking to former teammates, talking to former coaches, even talking to a current Blue Jays coach, just kind of like, because you want to look ahead a little bit too. And so that is like, you go into the feature kind of knowing what you need to get, and you let the interviews dictate maybe the specific direction of the story, like the actual details, the shape that it takes. But in general, you kind of know you're establishing sort of a profile, like you're kind of figuring out the general gist of it is like, who is Ryu? But there's other stories that kind of just come out naturally, like, I'm going to blank on an example, but I mean, for some reason this is coming to my head, and this wasn't an elaborate feature, but when I covered the team in 2018, when Marco Estrada was still a pitcher, and just being in the clubhouse every day, it was pretty well known that Marco Estrada really liked his robe, and he would wear it all the time. And these were the robes that were a big deal in 2015, I think, when Price bought them for the entire team. And so at the time in 2015, they were a present from Price, and the entire team would be wearing these robes. And that was like when the team was really hot and they were heading towards the playoffs, and just vibes were good and everything. So flash forward to 2018, Marco Estrada is basically the only player that still wears that robe. And he's worn this robe so much that it is like worn down. It's like, it's like faded blue. Like it used to be this like rich, like velvety blue color. And it just looks like a towel that you've used for like 10 years. So anyway, so I just knew that would be kind of a fun story.
Yeah.
And so I just talked to him one day about his robe. And then after talking to him, and we had such a fun conversation about the robe, then I knew, okay, I'm going to do a story on this robe. And so that was like a story that it kind of just came to me in the moment. And then the interview went well enough that I was like, okay, I can make a story out of this. So it wasn't necessarily like a story that I deeply like pitched and had to like do thorough research with. It was just kind of clicked in my brain, like, oh, I should ask him about that robe, see if there's anything interesting about it. And then I did, and then it kind of formed into a story. So it really depends like where the story comes from. Sometimes it's just like comes to you in a moment, and then you do the interview and it goes really well, and the story just flows out of you, and you just know exactly what it's going to be. And then there's other stuff where you're like, even like when Vlad was coming up before his debut, it was like everybody knew he was going to debut that year. So it was like, we have to do a Vlad story. How do we do a Vlad story? So I went down and I started sort of following him his last week or so of minor leagues. And I wrote two stories. One was like sort of about his path to basically being on the cusp of the majors. And then another story was like, we posted like the minute they announced that he was debuting, which was like all these like little anecdotes and stories that I had collected that were like kind of just the legend of Vlad. And it was like things that he had done, like he hit a home run so far, hit a hotel, and all these things. So that was like also another example where it's like you kind of just go down with like a topic. You're like, the topic is Vlad's going to debut, and then you kind of figure out, okay, how do I tell this? Who do I talk to? And again, like that was a situation where it was like, generally I know what I'm asking. I'm asking about Vlad. I'm asking what he did, why he's so impressive. And then you kind of just let the actual interviews and anecdotes dictate how the story flows.
No, that's really interesting. Like just different ways to be able to find a story and then be able to write a story. And Kaitlyn, you know, you've had the opportunity to not only cover baseball, but you've also covered tennis. And we're in such an exciting time right now in tennis. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, it sort of slowed that down. But in 2019, with Bianca Andreescu winning the U.S. Open and Dennis and Felix coming up the ranks, it's a really exciting time for a sports reporter to get into the sport of covering tennis. So I'm just curious for you, being able to parachute from baseball into covering tennis and how that's been able to just strengthen you as a sports reporter.
Yeah, so I did tennis before I did baseball. I did like, I think I'm going to forget the year here, but maybe it was 2015 might have been my first Rogers Cup. It was women's. I remember it was the women's, and I went for the National Post. And then I covered it. I didn't cover it last year, actually, because I think I was traveling or just was not able to have it work with the baseball season. But yeah, it is a nice sort of break. I mean, tennis is the sport that I always say is my favorite sport to watch.
Mm.
Just because I kind of grew up watching it and loving it. I never played. I'm not a good tennis player. My love of it does not come out of a love of like playing it. Quite frankly, like my love of sports doesn't really come out of playing them because I wasn't a great athlete anyway. I mean, I played everything like recreationally, but I was not like a superstar athlete in any way. So anyway, so for me, like it was such a thrill, especially early on in my career, because I think Rogers Cup was not my first sort of like live sporting event that I covered, but it was my first major one, and it was my first sort of like week-long assignment. Like I was just assigned to that, and so I got to do that. It was a thrill. Even that was like early days too, and like I worked at the newspaper, so I actually had like a really hard deadline. And it was just like, you know how late the matches go sometimes, and so I remember Jeannie Bouchard played on like a Tuesday or it was one of the nights. It was a night session, and it was actually lost, but it was a good match. It was like a 3-setter, so it went quite late, and the paper wanted it. And I just remember that was like my first real like sports journalist deadline experience, like trying to get it in on time. So yeah, I feel like I always have such a like warm spot in my heart for the Rogers Cup, just because it brings me back to like the early days of when I was really writing about sports and was also new to me and so exciting. I mean, it's still exciting for me, but it's been a really nice thing to watch, to see Canadian tennis players on the scene. Because I remember growing up and like, I mean, that's also kind of why I'm such a general tennis fan, because I didn't really have any like Canadians to root for when I was like watching as a kid. Like there was Daniel Nestor, and I remember like sometimes when he was even still playing singles, I was like, oh, Daniel Nestor's playing, but it was, he was really a double specialist, and he was never going to make huge inroads as a single star. So I just started liking all different kinds of tennis players, picking, I loved Andre Agassi and Leighton Hewitt growing up. Obviously Serena Venus. So for me, like, but now that you actually get to watch tennis as a Canadian and like know that there's people who are competing for your country and they're legitimate threats on the world scene, like that is so exciting to watch. I was so torn last year, like watching like Bianca play Serena, because like we all love Serena, right? Like she's a legend, and you're also watching Bianca and you're like, this is an amazing moment for Canada. Like it was such a tense, I think I was watching alone. I can't watch tennis, especially like the Grand Slams. I can't watch them with other people because they get too tense, especially the finals. Like Wimbledon final last year with like Roger and Djokovic, and it was just like the most
crazy match.
Yeah.
It was like it went like, I think it was the first 12-all tiebreaker in the 5th set of Wimbledon history, because they just changed the tiebreaker rules. So it was crazy. But I think like I agree with you. Like we've been blessed just to grow up with these, tennis legends like Serena Venus, Roger, Rafa, Novak. But now that we get to say, like, we have some of our own that are coming up through the ranks, like for the next 10 to 20 years, assuming they stay, healthy, it can be such a great time to cover the sport in this country. And even that US Open final, Bianca Serena, like people that weren't normally tennis fans are now tuning into this sporting event. So it just shows you that the sport is growing in a very positive way.
Oh yeah, I remember like being on the subway after the US Open final, like a couple days after, and there were these people standing near me and they were talking about it. And it was like, they were talking about it, and me being a fan, like you kind of know the lingo, and they weren't using the correct sort of tennis lingo. They were calling it, like games when they should have said points and all that. So it was getting that mixed up. So I knew like, okay, these aren't like hardcore fans, but they were so excited, like talking about it. And I remember just thinking like, wow, that's really cool. Like I would not have seen this like a few years ago, like somebody talking about the US Open final, like on the subway, who knows nothing about tennis, but they were just so excited to talk about, Bianca winning, that it was like, wow, really cool. It was a huge year for Canadian sports last year, obviously with the Raptors too. Like those two things combined, it was like, I don't know, it's just what a year for Toronto and Canada. Like just those two events alone, and there's probably other ones that were happening that I forget, but those two big events alone, it was like, how do you choose a moment? Like how do you choose, I mean, if you're a lifelong Raptors fan, the Raptors winning is always it for you. But yeah, like those those two moments, especially when you contrast it to like what this year looks like, and not going to be as many sports this year, obviously. It's just like you feel even more sort of excited thinking back on them, like how great they were in the moment.
Well, you even look at like this year, like, Djokovic winning the Australian Open could be the top tennis moment of the year, or like the Kansas City Chiefs winning the Super Bowl when like it was still like normal with fans in stadiums. So it's just crazy how a year can change so quickly. But Kaitlyn, I wanted to end things off with a question about baseball because, we talked about that at the top and how right now I know that MLB and MLBPA are in a tense negotiation to try to bring the season back in a shortened form. But from a Blue Jays fan's perspective, if the season does come back shortened, condensed, but with an expanded roster, which will allow more prospects to come on the team, perhaps like Nate Pearson, you got to be a little bit optimistic as a Blue Jays fan this year. And I'm sure you as a writer to be able to sort of cover this historical, weird moment where the team is young and there's exciting new players on the roster and there's a shortened amount of games. And who knows, if they have a good season, they may sneak into the postseason.
Yeah, and I mean, there was also talk, I don't know if it's like going to happen for certain, but there was talk of an expanded playoffs as well, so more teams would be getting in anyway, which makes sense because there's a condensed schedule, so you kind of need more teams getting in because there's less of a sample size. So, I mean, I think that it could go one of two ways. I mean, obviously it could go one of two ways, but like, the less games means that you need to get off to a hot start because a slow start could really kind of derail your entire season within the first month. At the same time, like every team is going to be in the same boat. I think the Blue Jays like have, a bit of maybe a leg up just because they have quite a bit of pitching depth. They have a lot of young pitchers, some of which have never even pitched in the majors. But in terms of like an expanded roster, maybe needing more pitchers to get through the early part of the season, I think the Blue Jays are fairly well equipped to sort of handle that because they do have a lot of depth there. They have a lot of depth in some of their other positions as well. And, it's really hard to say like how they would come out with a shortened season. I haven't really got to thinking about that yet. It's also interesting like how it'll shake out because you're now talking about maybe them just playing the AL East and the NL East, right? So that's a different makeup of some teams they're not used to seeing. So, that could also change things a little bit. I guess we'll wait and see. I mean, I do hope there is some form of baseball just because I think people would enjoy to watch it. At the same time, I want it done safely and I want everything to be done, following protocols. Public safety should come first, all those things we all want. But, I would love to be sitting there in July and watching baseball again. And, I think it could be an exciting year if there is baseball to be played. I think the team was really excited back in spring training, and some of the young guys, Bo and Kevin, were definitely their sort of game face was that they really wanted to surprise some people, and they really thought they were better than maybe people were giving them credit for. And, that you can make an argument that they could have been, because if you look at like sort of the timeline of last season when after Bo came up, I can't remember what their exact record was, but it wasn't that much below 500. It was like it was like a couple games below 500 after like July 29th or whatever it was. So, you can make the argument if they have that team, the whole year, and then there's obviously some internal improvement, the Blue Jays would have a better pitching staff. Then you're maybe looking at a ball club that is a few games above 500. And then if you're that, then maybe you're a few games out and there's expanded playoffs and who knows what's going to happen. So, now we're getting ahead of ourselves again, but we'll see. But, I think no matter what, if there's no baseball, just down the road, I think the Blue Jays have a fairly exciting team. And I think there's definitely things to look forward to, down the road.
No, for sure. Kaitlyn McGrath, she is the Toronto Blue Jays beat writer at The Athletic. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, and looking forward to reading more of your work, hopefully with baseball coming back soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me today.